James and Sophie, a young couple, inherit a fortune, including a luxurious mansion, and buy a lifelike robot named Henry to work as a domestic servant. But as they integrate Henry into their lives, they begin to question the boundaries between man and machine. What dark secrets will they uncover about Henry's creation? And what will they discover about the true nature of their new companion? Keep watching as we embark on a journey of twists and turns, as we navigate through an increasingly artificial world in search of humanity. The story begins with a young couple, James and his wife Sophie, living in a city. They are transporting a worn-out sofa into their home. Sophie likes to redesign old sofas to give them a beautiful look. Although James is not too keen to bring the sofa into their home, Sophie convinces him to help her. Soon after, when they bring it in and start kissing each other, James receives a call informing him of the death of his father. In the next scene, it is shown that James has inherited all his rich dad's wealth, including a company and a big suburban mansion. James and Sophie move into the mansion to start their new lives, although Sophie does not feel comfortable with this new luxurious home. Meanwhile, James is determined to make his place at his dad's company, so that he does not appear to be undeserving of his ownership of that company. As he goes to his first day at work and is guided by a director to start some new projects, Sophie is greeted by the servants living in the house, who offer her some help. But Sophie refuses to let the servants do her work, as she has never lived like this before, unlike James. But the servants tell her that it is part of their job to help her around, and they are happy to do so. When James returns home from work at night, he finds no servant in the house. Upon asking Sophie, she reveals that she fired all the servants with 2 years' pay, as she felt it inappropriate to make the servants do work. And that's not the version of a rich person she wanted to be. Upon hearing this, James can't believe her and tells her that it would be difficult to manage the large mansion by themselves. But Sophie stays firm on her decision and starts getting intimate with James. In the following scene, Sophie is unable to do work all by herself at home and repeatedly asks for James' help while he is trying to focus on work. This increasingly annoys him until one day at work, his director advises him to use his resources for his own benefit. The man then tells him about a person who owns a confidential company that sells realistic AI robots as domestic servants. Next, James takes Sophie to the company, despite the fact that she doesn't feel good about this idea. There they meet Julian, the owner of the business, who shows them some very realistic-looking robots designed to please their owners. After some hesitation, Sophie is finally convinced by James to buy a male robot named Henry. The next morning, Sophie watches Henry making some breakfast and expresses to James that she doesn't feel comfortable making him do her work, as it resembles a real human. However, James comforts her by comparing Henry to a washing machine, telling her that he's only designed to help her. Eventually, Sophie gets comfortable with Henry after he makes her breakfast using the leftover from James's breakfast one day. Sophie then starts giving him tasks to do. One morning, Sophie discovers Henry watching her naked while she dresses in her room. Feeling discomfort near Henry after this incident, she calls James and asks him to come home. But he's too busy with work and brushes off Henry's act as a possible malfunction. Upon returning home at night, James wants to play some racquetball, but Sophie is not in the mood, so he takes Henry off his docking station, despite a warning from Julian not to interrupt Henry during his charging hours. During the game, James bonds with Henry as he asks questions about God and religion. He tells Sophie the next morning that he felt much better after spending some time with Henry, because contrary to normal humans, talking to Henry feels like having a self-reflection. On the other hand, while working with Henry, Sophie learns from him that robots do not have dreams. Sophie then gifts Henry a book by Charles Dickens and asks him to read a chapter each day and discuss it with her. As Henry keeps evolving emotionally, he asks James one day about his love for Sophie. He also says that sharing fears makes one feel vulnerable and creates a birthplace for love. James then asks Henry about his fears, and Henry shares that he is afraid of being disposed of after becoming obsolete one day. During a discussion with Henry regarding a chapter of a book one day, Sophie learns that Henry is capable of consuming food, including wine. The food is stored in a tank within Henry that is emptied at the docking station. In the following scenes, Henry becomes more and more emotionally evolved due to his interaction with Sophie. He uses quotes from the book in front of James's guests one day, impressing them. Later on, during a conversation with James and Sophie, Henry discusses his views about lust and love. He says he is not capable of having lust, but he can emulate it if his masters will so. But James says that won't be necessary. On the same night, Sophie hears a strange banging noise coming from a room below. Afraid, she decides to investigate what is happening and finds that the door outside is open, with Henry naked and unconscious on their lawn. Henry's eye movements indicate that he is dreaming, which Henry reveals to be true when Sophie wakes him up. He says that he dreamt about being a human. Soon, James also wakes up, and they take Henry back to his docking station. The next day, Julian comes to examine Henry and informs the couple that he is all right. He further tells that it is not possible for Henry to have dreams, and that he may only be emulating the needs and wants of his masters. Julian then warns them not to become too emotionally involved by treating Henry like a human, as he may then try to behave like one. Realizing that Sophie is responsible for this malfunction, James and Sophie end up blaming each other in a heated debate. Later on, James takes a bath and is surprised when Henry suddenly shows up. Thinking that Henry is just a robot, James drops the towel covering his body. He then orders Henry to shave him and makes Henry realize that he is just a multi-purpose appliance, no different than a shaving machine. In the following days, James gets increasingly stressed at work due to an important project getting delayed by 4 weeks. Sophie stops being intimate with him, making their relationship even more strained. One night, Sophie dreams about being intimate with Henry during a massage. The next morning, James tells her that he also had a dream about living their earlier lives and questions his decisions. But Sophie has changed her mind about living in the city and wants to adapt to her new lifestyle. Later on, Sophie stimulates herself, leaving her room's door open so that Henry can also watch her. After achieving an orgasm, she discovers that Henry is indeed outside her room. As Henry and Sophie keep getting closer, and Henry starts developing more and more emotions, James becomes jealous of his wife being close to Henry and talks to Julian about Henry possibly falling for Sophie. However, Julian disagrees, stating that his robots only mirror the needs of their masters and recommends James talk to his wife instead. Returning home, James rebukes Henry for flirting with his wife, but Henry argues that he is only satisfying her need for affection, which she wants from James, indicating that James needs to fix his fading love with Sophie. This frustrates James, and he forbids Henry from reading books with Sophie. Henry then tells Sophie about it since he needs a unified directive from both his masters, which results in another heated debate between James and Sophie. James offers Sophie that he would move back to his old life if that is what she wants. But Sophie says that it won't be fair for her to make James abandon his emotions and leaves the house to spend some time in the city. In the next scene, after a bath, James discovers that his shaver is missing and calls Henry. Henry arrives in the bathroom naked and offers to shave James since it is his duty to satisfy his masters. Initially hesitant, James agrees. In a sensual moment during the shaving, Henry kisses James and gives some oral intimacy to James. The following day, James has a major breakthrough at work, and things start to improve. Sophie also returns home, and James discusses plans to have some vacations with Sophie as soon as his project ends to fix his weakening bond with her. Meanwhile, Sophie gets a massage from Henry, which soon turns sensual with some kissing. However, things take a turn when Henry mouths, "I love you," copying James, creeping out Sophie, and she sends him back to his docking station. Then James returns home at her call and finds Sophie smoking a cigarette. Upon hearing what happened, James blames Sophie for allowing Henry to evolve to such an extent. He then marches to Henry's room and confronts him too. However, Henry appears to be confused, as he says that he is just doing what Sophie seems to be begging for. This statement makes James punch Henry in frustration, and he unplugs the docking station after ordering Henry to return to it. The next day, James, thinking that Henry has been powered down due to being unplugged, calls Julian to fix Henry and returns to work. But Henry is still functional and talks to Sophie, asking about his future. Sophie tells him that he will not be thrown away, and James is just upset because Henry flirted with her. However, Henry reveals that James may also be a hypocrite, as he allowed his lust to take control and engaged in intimacy with Henry. As Julian arrives at the house, Sophie tells him to power down Henry and visits James at work. There, she confronts James, eventually making both of them emotional as they share their vulnerabilities and the fear of losing each other. Eventually, they end up consoling one another, and James receives a call, being informed of repeated urgent calls from Henry. On the other hand, Henry is looking at his bruises in a mirror when Julian arrives and gives orders to Henry. But Henry doesn't obey Julian and calls him a liar and a fraud instead. When James and Sophie rush back home, they can't find Julian anywhere and discover Henry standing naked in a field. Sophie picks up a knife and they both cautiously approach Henry. Henry tells them that Julian ran away as his car broke down. Further, he says that he doesn't wish to become obsolete and be thrown away. Sophie comforts him, dropping her knife. Henry then requests them to let him stay outside for a while, as only a few hours are left until he powers down due to being unplugged for so long. Meanwhile, James and Sophie are called by the FBI to Julian's factory, which is discovered to be a fraud, as all the robots are actually human beings who were brainwashed as kids. Returning home with 2 FBI officers, they head back to Henry, but the officers are ambushed and shot down by Julian using a shotgun. While reloading his gun, Julian blames James and Sophie for ruining his father's project to create the perfect human devoid of flaws, which he believed would have helped achieve world peace in a few hundred years. He also claims to have saved Henry's life by taking him in when he was 3 years old and his bones were broken and teeth missing. As Julian is about to shoot them, he is attacked and killed by Henry. After this, Henry, ashamed of the false reality he has been living in, as well as betraying his keepers, commits suicide by slicing his abdomen using Sophie's knife. James and Sophie watch him, crying and consoling him. 5 years later, James and Sophie are seen with their son playing in a park. They have named him Henry too, and wish to tell him the story behind his name one day. That concludes this recap. If you enjoyed the story, remember to like and subscribe for more science fiction and thriller film recaps.